Disestablishing the Cosmos, a meditation on infinite space. In the age of exploration, humans brave the geographical unknown. Now we summon up our courage to face the spiritual unknown, epitomized in the 21st century by our frank acknowledgement that so-called outer space is more likely to be infinite than finite. Consequently, owing to our inability to frame an image of something which, being infinite, is beyond imagining, we must reluctantly admit that the space we find ourselves in, and in which everything else is located, although nameable, is inconceivable. If, however, we can't conceive of where we are, how do we know who we are? For all we know, we might be the very aliens we're looking for. Unlike our ancestors, who assumed correctly that if they sailed long enough in any direction, they would ultimately touch land, our instruments of navigation, logic and intuition, confirm that we are awash on a shoreless sea. Any new world for us to discover, we must find right here on Earth. Ours, then, is the paradoxical task of mapping it out before we discover it. Or would you rather swing on a star, carry moonbeams home in a jar? Spiritually speaking, the exploration of outer space is nothing more than carrying moonbeams home in a jar. This meditation first appeared in 2006 under the chapter title Infinity in Sermon on the Flats. Sermon on the Flats, published by Psst Press. Many years ago I ran across Zeno's proof for the infinity of space. Zeno argues that space cannot end, for suppose it does, then you can stand at the edge of space and throw a spear beyond the boundary. But since the area beyond the boundary through which the spear passes is also space, space cannot end. I remember admiring Zeno's proof as an example of ancient Greek philosophical wit, and then dismissing it from my mind, or so I thought. But its significance was growing in my mind without my knowledge, and the soil in which it grew was enriched by what I call negative fertilizer. Negative fertilizer is the neglect in contemporary culture of an important concept for no other reason than that its recognition is inconvenient for the authorities of the culture, but that once attention is drawn to it, the concept becomes conspicuous by its absence, and reinstated in the culture over the objections of the authorities becomes part of the counterculture. In a word, the concept of infinite space undermines the claim of the authorities that the world is comprehensible and had best be left in the hands of those experts, namely themselves, who comprehend it. Consequently, the concept of infinite space is relegated to oblivion in contemporary scientific and theological thought. For example, in the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe, and in Judeo-Christian, Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist cosmology. One day, however, years after I had read Zeno's proof, and in spite of my habitual acquiescence to the spirit of the times, while I was casually looking at the sky, I felt the awesomeness of the notion that the sky is part of a space that cannot conceivably end. And I was struck with the enormity of the omission from the culture of the concept of infinite space. For didn't I see with my own eyes that the space I found myself in was beyond comprehension? And didn't logic confirm intuition, since no God could have created space without end, without having already occupied the space beforehand which it was about to create? I also felt fear at being unlocatable, the reason being that space without end conceivably contains an infinite number of inhabited planets without, however, anyone being the wiser. For inasmuch as the distance between any two planets in infinite space might also be infinite, and inasmuch as one infinity cannot exhaust another, therefore, with respect to each other, the inhabited planets would remain unlocatable. Finally, I felt a great sense of relief, which I suppose comes from having emerged from a state of falsehood into one of truth. That is, from having left a place of confinement I hadn't even been aware I had entered, until, as they say, the scales fell from my eyes. For during the whole time I had been preoccupied with the spectacle which the producers of civilization had assured me was all there was to see. The seed of Zeno's proof had sprouted in negative fertilizer and grown into a great tree in which I was destined to perch like an owl under the moon, hooting plaintively for its mate. Next, I reasoned that because of the continuous nature of space, that part of space which I see must be contiguous with the parts out of sight, and those parts in turn with the parts beyond, and so on ad infinitum. Then I became embarrassed at my loose use of language. I was assuming that I can divide infinite space into parts, a procedure valid for finite volumes, because division of a volume into parts presupposes that the parts add up to a whole, so that the volume which contains the parts is a whole, or finite. And because infinite space is a volume, and volumes in general are divisible into subvolumes, by dividing into parts, I had inadvertently treated infinite space as if it were a finite volume. Nevertheless, were it possible to speak of the parts of infinite space without subverting its infinity, I could claim with justice that the parts of infinite space exist simultaneously. So, when I look at the sky, infinite space in its entirety must be present, not just some portion of it, while another portion has yet to turn a corner, even though the concept of infinite space in its entirety, while nameable, is inconceivable. Thus, logic corroborates the intuition that all of infinite space must exist simultaneously with the part of it that I behold. To reiterate, it was by gazing at the part of infinite space closest to me, namely the sky, and by inferring, since I lack the power to imagine it, the simultaneity of all the parts of infinite space with the part closest to me, that I felt the actuality of the inconceivable, whose duration, like its extension, is without beginning or end, and whose existence is singular and unique, for how could there be room for a second infinite space already occupied by the first? I summarize the infinity of space, its endless duration, its uniqueness, and the immediacy with which the simultaneous existence of all its parts impresses itself on me by declaring that the onceness of space is a onceness without end. In general, I was trying to play by the rules of logic. I sanction intuition of the inconceivable so long as I did not contradict myself when I expressed the intuition. If I did contradict myself, I deemed the intuition false. I had already admonished myself with regard to expressions like the parts of infinite space. Part implies whole, but the whole of an infinity is questionable, or infinite space in its entirety. That such expressions misleadingly presuppose that infinite space is a self-contained unity. That is, while no mortal can conceive of infinite space in its entirety, nevertheless, if we personify infinite space by making it a god and attribute point of view to infinity itself, then surely infinity can grasp itself as a unity if anybody can. The supposition, however, is futile, because the concept of point of view, by definition, prescribes limitation, point of view, as if viewing from a single and mutually exclusive standpoint. Thus, to ascribe to infinity omniscient point of view, which is what infinity must have to be aware of itself, is meaningless, since omniscient or ubiquitous point of view is equivalent to pointlessness of view. And so awareness lacking a specific point of view is self-contradictory. Moreover, to ascribe to infinite space an awareness of its infinity, at least as vivid as my own awareness of my finitude, is really surreptitiously to override the inconceivability of infinite space by making it conceivable to itself and then expecting it patronizingly to mask its inconceivability and stand beside me as if posing for a photograph. Infinite space aware of itself is the basis of the idea of God. But I thought that by circumventing the inconceivability of infinite space in an attempt to make it conceivable and concrete, the inventors of the idea of God had been embarrassed by the inconceivability of infinity and chosen to conceal its actuality behind a mirage. Next, I turn my attention from the magnitude to the content of space. I believe that everyone who has witnessed the operation of the law of falling bodies has marveled some time or other at the fact that the stars are fixed in the firmament and that the sun, moon, and earth appear to float in space. The question naturally arises why the stars, moons, and planets do not precipitously plunge downwards. Scientists speak authoritatively of gravitational fields and the lack of them. But my explanation, unlike that of science, which resents the infinity of space as an imposition on credulity, was much simpler. There's nowhere to fall. Planets that dare to fall through space would fall forever. Therefore, rather than endure this terrifying absurdity, they prefer to go in circles, a preference for circularity which has been programmed into matter for aeons without end. Furthermore, having taken up the idea that matter has been struck dumb by finding itself stranded in infinite space, I had to admit that the entire universe and everything in it, to one degree or another, animals instinctively, matter pre-instinctively, and humans consciously, are so repulsed by the ungainliness, opacity, and remoteness of infinite space that the mere presence of it throws them into a dither. This dither is what we call the order of nature. I recall that David Hume, the 18th century British philosopher, after determining that there was no logical basis for explaining natural phenomena by invoking the principle of cause and effect, concluded that the universe sticks out of habit. I, however, had gone Hume one better. I realized that habit itself is motivated by something even more fundamental, namely, terror of the inconceivable in general, and of the inconceivability of infinite space in particular. For to my mind, the likeliest reason why the electrons of an atom whirl about a nucleus, planets orbit suns, and the minds of anxious people go in circles is because everything finite abhors the infinite space it finds itself in. Hence, everything finite goes in circles in a futile attempt to discover a way out of infinity. Since there is no escape, the universe goes into denial. The circle is christened the paradigm of beauty, order, and truth, instead of what it really is, a treadmill of fear. The nuclei of body cells, the hub of cities, the eye of the hurricane, the ego as the central focus of the psyche, the ethical dictum that what goes around comes around, implying quite arbitrarily that the nature of retribution is circular, the rounded shape of fruit and flowers, of the planets and luminaries, etc., etc., all testify to the obsessive infatuation on the part of nature with the circular, the spherical, the finite. Infinite space, on the other hand, is ignored like the 13th witch in the fairy tale, whom the king fails to invite to the birthday party. For infinite space is inconceivable, and thus makes everyone and everything feel stupid. Therefore, among humans, the concept of infinite space is withdrawn to the periphery of consciousness, where it remains invisible but not inactive. On the contrary, it festers and tumors into a formidable circular wall of denial, whose thickness and height extend without end. Consequently, we feel claustrophobic as the result of being infinitely walled up, and at the same time agoraphobic, because the presence of infinite space, ever available to the eye, is terrifyingly real. In summary, what I really thought once I risked expressing my contempt for the virtuosi of hysteria who remain conspiratorially silent with regard to infinite space is that the order of the universe and the natural laws of physics document an obsession-compulsion on the part of the material universe to repeat the same motions over and over for fear that if it, the material universe, lowered its guard for a single moment, chaos, the negative side of infinity, would ensue. So, what we call the evidence of natural order is really symptomatic of a disorder, which, presumably incurable, results from the physical universe recoiling from the position it finds itself in of having been shot out of a cannon into infinite space without a leg to stand on. Having reinstated infinite space in cosmological theory, I felt confident that I could explain how the forces of attraction and repulsion operate in the universe. The existence of a universe, I argued, fosters the illusion that space is a spherical volume of vast but finite dimension, possessing a single center, the sun in the visible universe, and by analogy, God in the invisible one, which is the source of all reality and around which everything revolves. The irresistible craving for this illusion, a craving which, inherent in all matter, arises in response to an overwhelming repugnance to infinity, draws everything toward each other, as if all were attracted by a charismatic central point, instead of, what is in fact the truth, repelled by a boundless periphery. An unforeseen consequence of this adoration for centrality, however, is that each entity secretly flatters itself that it already occupies the center of the universe. This self-assurance of its centrality enables every entity to act with the confidence necessary to maintain its trajectory in the face of the counterclaims to centrality of every other entity. Nevertheless, the multiplication of centralities of every kind ad infinitum makes sustaining the illusion of a single unified spherical volume problematic, since a sphere with an infinite number of centers annihilates the very notion of sphericity and implies instead the actually shapeless infinity of space. Since, therefore, the content of the universe consists of competing spherical centers, only one of which, or a single pair or exclusive group, must occupy a true center, if the illusion that the sphere, that is, the universe, is finite, is not to seem a sham, to avoid this calamitous admission, things resolve their rivalry by guardedly circling each other, like Japanese sumo wrestlers, or like planets. The notion that the planets revolve around the sun is a convenient fiction for sustaining the illusion that space is centralized and therefore finite. In fact, the planets circle each other, the repulsion which all feel toward infinity, creating a centripetal force balanced by the repulsion each planet feels toward the other, producing a centrifugal force. The result is the arrangement of orbits. The central position of the Sun, on the other hand, is purely accidental, and is owing to the fact that the Sun, like all stars, is too paralyzed with fear to move. When at last the Sun ceases to sweat bullets, burns out, and everything is plunged into darkness, mark my words, I said to myself, the planets will continue to make their rounds, as punctually as guards patrolling a perimeter. Then I congratulated myself that while Copernicus had removed the Earth from the center of the universe, I had removed the center. Suddenly I imagined a physicist smile condescendingly and lodge an objection. Marvin, you propose that the orbiting of the planets around the Sun expresses a natural preconscious confusion and anxiety at being in infinite space. But you propose it for no better reason than that we describe a confused or anxious person as going in circles. Planets, however, are not people, so how can they express anything? To which I replied that science assumes that in the beginning primordial matter was homogeneous. Everything was composed of the same simple substance. Moreover, after matter evolved, it subsequently separated into the organic and inorganic, the living and the inert. Now, while biochemists take for granted that the organic retains traces of the inorganic, they have no interest in maintaining the converse, namely, that the inorganic contains the seeds of the organic. In other words, that the instinct for life is, as it were, buried alive in dead matter. The reason they have no interest is because the theory of the evolution of the universe is a one-way street. Matter evolves from the homogeneous and simple to the heterogeneous and complex, from the inanimate to the animate. But for someone to argue in the reverse direction, proceeding from the animate, anxious people think in circles, to the inanimate, circling planets must therefore be anxious. And while not denying that the animate does indeed evolve out of the inanimate, yet claims that the animate must have coexisted with the animate as a claims that the animate must have coexisted with the inanimate as a latent but not negligible force from the beginning, nagging the inanimate ever more insistently into life, is unacceptable to the scientific world. And this, for no better reason than that, since, as I say, the theory of evolution is a one-way street, scientists are trained to have one-way minds with regard to it. Consequently, to think the wrong way is professionally illegal and punishable by revocation of one's license to operate a train of thought in public. Hence, by arguing that matter is instinct with life, I was driving the wrong way down a one-way street. Nor can anyone follow me without acknowledging the reality of infinite space, which provides matter with a motive for being wound up and on edge. In all honesty, I had to admit that long before my intuition of infinite space led me to theorize that the universe is a fossil of fear, like millions of others, I had naively fallen into the habit of treating things as if they were alive. Perhaps I learned the habit from my mother. My mother was not given to profanity, but I recall that whenever she accidentally burned or cut herself in the kitchen, she would cry out in exasperation and rage, "Those bastards!" as if unseen enemies had sabotaged her luck and caused her to injure herself. These outbursts, I confess, amused me until I noticed that I would shout, "You fuckers!" at whatever recalcitrant material resisted manipulation in the course of a home repair, thereby investing the material with a will of its own opposed to mine. I was actively engaged in combat, where presumably the best man would win. My mother, on the other hand, appeared to equate the impossibility of preventing an accident which had already occurred with the impossibility of discovering the whereabouts of her nameless enemies and bringing them to justice. My mother's oath was a surly admission of defeat. Her son's indicated that he was spoiling for a fight. But both of us quite casually treated objects as if they were alive. Psychologists, of course, would consider our behavior anthropomorphic. That is, that my mother and I had childishly projected our humanness onto inanimate objects and were pretending that they were alive. Certainly we had done that. But the objects had lent themselves so convincingly to the roles we had assigned them that I wondered whether in fact the objects weren't pretending to be inanimate so that they could continue to harass us with impunity. For just because they never broke character didn't mean they weren't acting. On the contrary, they gave every indication of playing themselves with consummate skill. I had described the universe as if the operation of natural law is evidence that organic matter evolved out of an inorganic footprint of awareness, which millions of years later blossomed into consciousness. I was drawn to this theory because once I admitted the actuality of infinite space, I had to allow for the possibility that its pervasive and unremitting presence affects the behavior of the finite entities contained within it. Moreover, since infinite space, while actual, is inconceivable, I gauged the effect on matter of being placed in a container which is inconceivable to be primordial bewilderment, a state of confusion from which matter recoils by going in circles in a vain attempt to sustain the illusion that space is finite. Whence arises that obsession with centrality, which from the subatomic to the galactic is the defining characteristic of matter. The question for me then, once I acknowledged the infinite, was how to introduce it into my life in such a way that a creature with toes and tears, who only lives once, and that briefly, may accommodate itself to a space without end which endures forever, and to do so, moreover, without equivocating with regard to the shocking finality of death. All creatures only live once, but human creatures know that they are once-onlys. The knowledge that some fine day my life must break off, never to be taken up again, is disconcerting, to say the least. Nor while I live, so long as I routinely anticipate the future as part of my arsenal of defense for staying alive in the present, I cannot avoid foreseeing the inevitability of my unconditional extinction. Unless, of course, I divert my attention with drugs or drink or religious fantasy, not recreationally, but out of desperation. As much perhaps as the certainty of dying, the inconceivability of being dead disturbs my composure. Although I can easily imagine myself dying, surprisingly, the ability to picture myself dead is completely beyond me. For one thing, I cannot imagine myself dead without conceding that I am at least sufficiently alive to continue witnessing my corpse, and thus I contradict the premise that I am dead, that is, that I am oblivious of myself. Or if after I die I am no longer myself, but something greater or lesser, then my corpse is no longer mine, and I contradict the premise that it is I who is dead. Thus I cannot conceive being dead without thinking nonsense. Once I suspect that the cessation without end that follows my death is inconceivable, unless I beg the question by pretending I am someone else who pretends to be me, I respond either by suppressing the truth in favor of the fantastic, that is, by riding roughshod over logic, in the belief that the defenselessness of logic makes it a natural prey to my aggressive will to believe anything I wish. This maneuver arising from a kind of mental might is right credo, adopted by adherents of the afterlife religions. Or I respond by resigning myself to the truth in the hope that the truth, perplexing though it may be, especially when it is inconceivable, keeps me human. That is, helps me to be an animal which articulates its dumbfoundedness amicably instead of resentfully. In short, that my death is inconceivable doesn't mean that I don't die, but rather that it is by means of my death that I relate to infinite space. I take up this topic in the 3rd chapter of Sermon on the Flats. Even though the several billion people alive at the moment only live once, here I gave my meditation up to the winds of thought, to be carried wherever they blew. Not one of them can rival the immediacy of my awareness of my living body, or of my awareness of my awareness. The best that any of us can do when we meet, and sensing rapport rather than danger, wish to put ourselves in each other's place, is to imagine we share a single body or share a single mind, which we call having a relationship. But the power to sustain the image of our unity is steadily eroded by the absolute isolation of each from the other that craves the poetry of relationship in the first place, an isolation that culminates at the moment of death, when each must suffer ultimate shipwreck in an unknown sea. Paradoxically, then, foreknowledge of death underwrites our unity to the same extent that it predicts the dissolution of the unity. Or to put it differently, our sociability relieves our isolation, but our isolation deepens our sociability. Under the thin crust of poetry upon which we live, all is silence. Since the relation of each to him or herself cannot be duplicated, each is special to him or herself. This specialness of the individual is projected onto the relationship which individuals create. I love you more than myself, the lover declares, carried away by emotion into hyperbole, but signifies by it you are as close to me as if you were a part of me, and therefore are as special to me as I am to myself, just as I hope I am as close to you as you are to yourself. Moreover, and here our lovers take a mystical turn, for relationship, after all, is merely the prosaic name for the alchemic vessel of our love. Our relationship, our union, which rests upon our mutual awareness, is itself capable not only of being aware of us, but of also being self-aware, as if it were a living person in its own right, so that when from time to time we read each other's mind, it is the relationship that has become thoughtful. The psychic doll we make and cause to nestle into itself feels life. Our relationship is special. The notion of being special implies exclusivity. My relation to myself is special because everyone without exception is excluded. The same applies to the relationship consisting of me and you. If we deem it special, as we do, we exclude others from it. Friends may orbit around it like satellites, but logically they cannot form the essence of it. Now, as a utopian Democrat with a small d, I feel obliged to apply the notion of specialness to an ideal global society to see if the application makes sense. Conjure up, if you will, the vision of a world population such that everyone claims to be united in brotherhood and to compose a single mythic person who personifies the social unity. They claim, in other words, to love each other in a way that makes everyone feel special. But if everyone feels special, who is excluded? No one is excluded. If no one is excluded, then, according to our assumption that specialness requires exclusion, we must disallow the possibility that the feeling of being special contributes to the public spirit of a democratic society. But that's tantamount to admitting that the feeling of love inappropriately characterizes the feeling that the members of such a society have for each other. How then is a utopian democratic society even possible? Love does not lead the way to a good life for all. Equality does. People do not have to love each other, that is, to think of each other as special in order to enjoy the good life together. All that's required is that they participate in the good life equally, by virtue of owning it equally, inasmuch as they are equally dependent upon it for their livelihood. In other words, utopian democratic society is not founded on love and brotherhood, but on the equal self-interest of each in actively sharing in the joint ownership of the global economy. Such a society is imbued with a different kind of poetry than that found in the literature of romantic love or of Christian homily. One perhaps more akin to the wording of a marriage contract than to that of a love sonnet. Therefore, it is to self-interest that we turn, where, by virtue of shared ownership, the self-interest of each and the mutual interest of all are reconciled, in order to characterize the public life of utopian democracy. Never forgetting, however, that the public life, the work life of society, is not the end of social endeavor, but the means by which we fund the private lives of all, where self-relation and the poetry of love receive their fullest expression. Private life is the soul of democracy. Public life, and especially work life, its life-sustaining body. To reiterate, we don't have to love each other to achieve the good life for all, but we do have to be equally self-interested in seeing it come to pass. But equal self-interest requires that all, however prestigious or ordinary the contribution of each, are equal co-producers, equal co-owners of it. Otherwise, if your share of the good life is larger than mine, then I stop being interested when I have attained my limit, irrespective of the fate of the whole. Furthermore, if maintaining your larger share requires you to manipulate the whole in order to ensure that I do not exceed my limit, then our mutual interest dissolves into conflicting interests, and suddenly we're back in the good old detestable world. But, you ask, must I give up my villa in Mallorca and my chauffeur in LA in order to participate in your good life? My dear, I answer, I don't really know. But if I were you, I wouldn't ask anyone who, presumably your equal, is homeless and on foot.